Hello, and welcome to the Why We Argue podcast. I'm Robert Talisse, your host. I'm professor of philosophy at Vanderbilt University. Why We Argue is produced by Humility and Conviction in Public Life, a project based at the University of Connecticut, which explores how to balance our deepest commitments with open-mindedness, a respect for reason, and intellectual humility. The series, which is made possible by generous funding from the John Templeton Foundation, features brief discussions with publicly minded thinkers about the state of civil discourse in contemporary democracy. Now, today, my guest is Joshua Cohen. Josh is a distinguished political philosopher who has held the Martha Sutton Weeks Professorship in Ethics and Society at Stanford University and the Leon and Anne Goldberg Professorship of the Humanities at MIT. He is currently on faculty at Apple University and is Distinguished Senior Fellow at the School of Law, the Department of Philosophy, and the Department of Political Science at Berkeley. In addition to all this, Josh has edited the Boston Review since 1991. Hi, Josh. How are you?
Pretty good, Bob. Nice to talk.
Nice to talk to you, too. So let's get to it. The U.S. election, the preceding campaign season, and the president's first month in office, I think by anyone's measure, have all been surprising. Now you, Josh, have been one of the pioneers in formulating and advocating a conception of democracy according to which public deliberation, public discourse, the sharing and exchanging of reasons are all central to the democratic idea. And the democratic ideal, and might even be intrinsically tied to the very idea of a legitimate democracy. But I think also maybe by anyone's measure, public discourse these days seems to have many troubling aspects. And perhaps some of those troubling aspects might be not just unfortunate, but bad for democracy or contributing to the degradation of democracy. What are your thoughts about the state of public discourse in the country these days?
It's terrible. Let's move on to the next question. Let me try to be a little more subtle than that, though I do think it's pretty bad. And since it's obvious that it's pretty bad, let me say a few things about ways that, on the upside, that it may not be so bad. And I say these not because on balance I think things are very rosy, but because it may be helpful in getting a little, a more balanced assessment, since I think lots of us, including me, are, very concerned about the state of public discourse and public policy and politics.
Sounds good.
Yeah. So, so a few things. First, I think take the what I think is, awful executive order on immigration and refugees that was issued on January 27th. I think there's been a very powerful and, to this point, from practically speaking, effective pushback from the courts on the executive order. And the pushback from the courts, I think, has not only stopped halted the execution of the order, but I think that the pushback from the courts has improved the quality of, my sense from where I sit, improved the quality of public discussion about both the substantive issues about immigration and borders, and also the issues about the nature of executive orders, the power of courts, the power of the executive. And I'm just going to take a couple of kind of observations like that. I think the insane quality of lots of public discourse has also had a kind of a focusing effect for lots of large and small media outlets. Media outlets is a jargon like the New York Times and the Washington Post, and I think there's been a lot of very serious thinking and rethinking of what the role of the media is, what the norms of political coverage are, a willingness to call out lies as lies, or misrepresentations of the truth as misrepresentations of the truth, a break from a norm of reporting both sides of a story as the standard way to do business. This is something that Jay Rosen at NYU has been very, very thoughtful in discussions of. This kind of arresting impact on the, and I know it. You mentioned I edit Boston Review. We have thought very hard about the implications of this degenerate state of public discourse for the kinds of things that we should be doing. So I think the courts have had this maybe have upped their game and upped the game of public discussion around the issues that they've been engaged in. I think the media have upped their game. I think there's been, for people who are broadly on, my side of the of political discussion, people broadly on the left. I think for some people, there's been a kind of renewed awareness to go to this idea of humility plus conviction, that lots of us have had lots of conviction and maybe not enough humility. I think there's been an increased self-awareness among some progressives about the ways in which we have been guilty of the very kinds of behaviors of knee-jerk assertions, partisan, using partisan prisms to evaluate evidence and issues, insufficient appreciation of the available arguments on other sides of issues, or of the burdens on people different from ourselves. So those are three things. Courts may be upping the game in public discussion about some issues because courts are under attack. Media, I think, doing a much better job than they had done for a long time, and really changing their conception about how they're supposed to engage in and provide an infrastructure for public discussion, and also maybe an impact on the self-understanding of progressives, and maybe a better sense of the need for a more appropriate combination of humility and conviction as well.
Excellent. So let me ask about the sort of first two in your trio, because the courts and the media are not the two, but maybe the central two institutions of democracy that seem to have been called into question, particularly by some of the president's recent pronouncements about so-called judges, for example, and about fake news.
Yes.
So I really appreciate. Let me just say, I really appreciate the optimistic thought. But
I was hearing a but that was about.
Yet, one wonders when so much of the public discourse, and maybe I'll confess, I might spend a little too long sort of not participating in, but monitoring and looking at comments threads and things. And it's very, very disconcerting in a way. to see how quickly these forums turn on the courts and the media as fundamentally anti-democratic agencies in our society. That fake news, the term, now just means news that reports something that challenges your own political perspective. And the so-called judges, that the unelected, unaccountable judiciary seems, again, not merely to be criticized on the grounds that it looks like in a democracy you can criticize judges for the rulings that they render, and criticize the courts and criticize judicial review. I mean, we could do all this, but the idea that these are fundamentally illegitimate and anti-democratic institutions seems to be becoming prevalent in a way that at least gives me reason to think that the optimism has to be really qualified at this point.
Yeah. I think of it as hopefulness rather than optimism. But anyway, but let me optimism. I think of as the view that Martin Luther King characterized as the myth of time. That is, that, as he put it, that progress rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. If that's optimism, I'm not optimistic. Progress doesn't roll in on the wheels of inevitability. But hopefulness, I take, is a different thing. So let me say two things. I think there may be two different points that you're making, and let me try to make a few comments about each. So on the point about courts and media as two key institutions in democracy, yes, and that's why I singled them out. And let me back up a step. If you go back to Madison Federalist 51, the idea is, he has the idea there about ambition being made to counteract ambition, and that's a way in which you prevent overweening exercises of power. He was particularly interested in the ambition of the legislature, of Congress, counteracting the ambition of the executive, and vice versa. The ambition of Congress is not doing much counteracting of the ambition of the executive because of partisan and for that matter, policy allegiances between the Republican-dominated Congress and the president, despite differences, arguably persisting differences on views about Russia and on views about trade policy. There's an enormous amount of overlap there, and there is the common partisan affiliation. I think what's happened because of the attacks, not just on individual judicial decisions in particular cases, or just on particular journalists or papers or cable news channels or whatever, but because there's been a kind of an attack on the institutions, with comments about Judge Curiel, for example, or with the comments about Judge Robar being a so-called judge. Those are attacks on the institution. And I think what's happened is that there's been a recognition of that on the part of a bunch of people in the press and a bunch of judges. And what they're doing is pushing back, not just about particular stories or about particular cases, but pushing back in defense of the institution itself. Now, as it happens, something you pointed out, one of the things that courts are supposed to do is not only come to decisions in particular cases, but provide, play a role in um, uh, contributing to a kind of principled discussion of issues of public concern. Not that they are the sole arbiters or arguably even the supreme judges of those issues, but they help to move discussions about political issues onto they contribute to moving them onto a plane of principle. And I think that they've been playing that role, which is an improvement in the quality of public discussion. And I think the same thing is true of the media. That's their role. And I think there's been much deeper self-consciousness because of the attack on them as institutions about the need to play that role. Now, so yes, there's a defense of these important, I think a rather self-conscious defense of these important democratic institutions in the spirit of ambition being made to counteract ambition. Now, you rightly then observed that if you look at social media outlets, the discussions there often degenerate pretty quickly. I'm maybe a more active participant in some of that than you. I'm pretty regular both observer and participant on Twitter. Yeah. And less on Facebook these days. And also there's a kind of far right alternative to Twitter. It happens to be far right by who's there, gab.ai. And I was spending a little bit of time there. And you're right that, those are not models of, neither one of those are models of public reason exactly. But at least on the surface. But let me make two observations there. First of all, in the case of Twitter, I think it's a little bit silly to regard Twitter as a forum for discussion. I mean, the messaging is too short. I think the role of Twitter is it's a broadcast medium. It's a way that you call people's attention to things that are worth reading. And I myself benefit enormously from that. I follow a few people. They point me in the right direction to things that are worth reading that I wouldn't otherwise have noticed. And some of the things that I read the things that I get pointed to and read are all over the place politically. So I learn a bunch from doing that. And I think if you use it properly, there's a great deal to be learned. I also do get into, the conversations, arguments with people who I really disagree with and wouldn't otherwise be engaged with at all. And honestly, what I find is, this is, as John Stuart Mill wouldn't have been surprised by this. Right. You learn stuff, and you learn stuff even when you don't change your mind. That Millian idea that you get a better grip through public debate on the meaning and the grounds of your convictions, even when you don't change your convictions. Absolutely true. It's real. I find it really clarifying. I don't find it clarifying when, I start getting the Jew this and Jew that, which, is about 1% of what I get. Mm-hmm. But, people disagree pretty sharply, and this goes to the humility point. You end up having to think harder. Public discussion, serious public discussion, is a hard business. And to go back to my earlier point, I think lots of people with whom I agree on lots of issues are, to put it maybe very bluntly, are just as lazy in thinking about stuff as the people they disagree with. And I'm pointing to myself when I say that. And that's one of the things that I've learned by engaging with people with whom I fundamentally disagree. I mean, and when I say people with whom I fundamentally disagree, one person I've gotten to know on Twitter is Richard Spencer, the all right. I fundamentally disagree with him. We met on Twitter. We communicated some. I met up with him in person. We had a conversation for a couple of hours. I didn't exactly try to persuade him of anything. He didn't exactly try to persuade me, but I learned a bunch from. I find his views completely loathsome. I found them no less loathsome after meeting him than I did before meeting him. Nevertheless, I think I am more convinced than ever that Mill was right about the value of engaging in debate around with people with whom you fundamentally disagree. Anyway.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. John Stuart Mill is a hero of mine as well. But do you run into the following kind of trouble? Not from the people who you fundamentally disagree with, but from the people who you share political ground with, in that in my own engagements of in these sort of Millian ways, I've come across the view that to take certain kinds of oppositional views seriously in that Millian way is to capitulate to them, or to dignify them in a way that it's not only strategically unwise to dignify them or capitulate to them or acknowledge them, but also maybe politically suspicious. Do you come across that?
I come across that some, but actually not so much. I mean, there have been a couple of people, there's one person in particular, and who was really beating up on me for engaging at all in just the way that you described, whether it was dignifying or legitimating or some bad thing to these views. And the fact of the matter is, if you're going to engage at all in ways that that you might learn something from, typically what you've got to do is, bend over backwards to, have a bunch of people yelling at you, and you have to, you have to be much politer to them than you are to your friends. And so there's at least one person, maybe there are two people who've come at me pretty hard, but it's not I don't think that's a crazy thing to think. So I didn't mind. I think that too. I thought, maybe you're right. I don't think so, but the voice of this person, kind of slapping at me, is vividly present for me when I do this kind of thing. But I don't. I mean, here's it's an example that's in this space. So after the Milo fiasco at Berkeley, there was I said something on Twitter, basically, and it was partly in response to what Ben Trump had said about, I don't know, taking money away from Berkeley or some horse shit.
Right.
What it was. But anyway, I said something. I made 4 points. First, that I thought, Milo was, an asshole. Secondly, that I thought the protests were great. That it was great that people came out to protest. Third, that I thought the silencing and violence were bad. And fourth, that I thought, Trump should, shut up. And that was on the fact that he had gone after the university. And no one, not a single person said, oh, Millian asshole, silencing was good. Right. No one. I mean, literally no one. But I got a shitstorm a shitstorm from the right because I distinguished between the protest, which I thought was great, and the silencing and violence, which I thought was bad. And these people all thought that this was just bullshit to distinguish between these two. And when I say shit, I mean, I don't know, 1,000 people.
Wow.
It was like, there is this trolling or whatever, and this phenomenon of this swarming, and it was, like 6-year-olds playing soccer, like they all go to the ball. Well, they all, there are a lot of people who get, and so I don't get, yeah, I just didn't, I can really go back to what I said before about this one or maybe it's two people. It's really infrequent. I found for myself anyway to get that kind of criticism. Yeah.
So
let me add one other thing,
sure.
because in the earlier part of the conversation, we were talking about courts and the media as institutions, and I was saying that they were not only pushing back against criticisms on particular decisions or particular stories, but defending the institutions themselves, which have an important role in public discussion, and I think arguably that'll have beneficial consequences on public discussion. I don't want to single them out to the exclusion of singling out of emphasizing what I think will probably be a pretty good consequence for public discussion of lots of people feeling, people, progressives, people on the left feeling like, rightly, that they are under assault and getting politically engaged. And when I look at these, town halls where lots of people are showing up and, pissed off and pushing back hard, I think that probably, it's unfortunate that it took this, potentially disastrous, calamitous election to have that effect. But I think there's been a powerful effect on, political mobilization, and political mobilization in ways that I think, could well have a positive impact on public discussion. So, we'll see about that. And also, similarly, I think there's been a renewed appreciation because of this victory of Trump and the Republicans at the national level. There's also been a renewed appreciation of the incredible weakness of the political left, whether the Democrats or alternatives to the Democrats, at the subnational level. And I think there's a fair bit of engagement that's happening at that level. And I also think that that's probably likely to have a good effect on public discussion. But we'll see. But I don't want to just focus on the fancy institutions, so to speak, and neglect the what's core to democracy, public engagement. Anyway.
Great.
Yeah.
So you've been very generous with your time. Let me ask one more question to wrap us up. Do you have any lessons or advice that you might share with our listeners about, for example, how they might engage with social media?
I do think that I love this humility conviction pairing. And what I love about it is that both things are really important, and it's really hard to have both. It can, it's easy to feel that humility is the enemy of conviction. That's the old, Robert Frost on liberals, or people who can't take their own side in an argument. Mm-hmm. That conviction is the enemy of humility. I don't think that the one is the enemy of the other, but they are hard to maintain in a kind of, equipoise. And I think the way I've found just speaking for myself and reiterating in a way what I was saying earlier, I think that the way you can learn things in these, actually, let me make 2 points. First, the way you can learn things in these social media settings is probably by erring on the side of humility. And erring on the side of humility means, being very, very aware of the ways in which you're doing the very things that you're accusing other people of doing. Mm-hmm. The kind of, resting too much on, on preconceptions, reading controversial evidence in ways that conform to your pre-existing convictions, so erring on that side is helpful in when you're engaging in conversations, and I do think, I find, as I say, that I do learn something. I learn a bunch by doing that. The other thing I think is that, if you think about these social media outlets, let's say Twitter and Facebook in particular, Gab, I don't know how long that'll go, and it's a very narrow band of opinion on it. These are really pretty new. I mean, Facebook is, roughly a decade old. Twitter, roughly a decade old, although, with a little bit slower growth initially. And I don't think we've kind of learned yet how to, what the appropriate norms of engagement and criticism and response and non-response and are there. And it takes time to figure out how to do these things. And so I think that a little bit of so a combination of humility, if you're going to learn something, and you can learn things, humility, really important. Secondly, not just humility, but patience, trying to figure out, what the norms of discourse are in these, still relatively new venues for mass communication. And I always do that. Informed by, very, this sort of the background conviction from, Lincoln about patient confidence in the ultimate justice of the people. What better hope is there? And, there are lots of circumstances like the present where it's easy to lose firm grip on that hope and on the grounds for that patient confidence. But I don't know. I think people give up too quickly. I think, democracy and it's hard work. It's really hard work. So that's my recommendation. Do the hard work.
Josh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for your time for talking to us. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in to the Why We Argue podcast, which I remind you is produced by the University of Connecticut's Humility and Conviction in Public Life Project with generous support from the John Templeton Foundation. You can follow the project on Twitter and on Facebook at at Public Humility. That's one word, Public Humility. Thank you so much, and bye for now.